Hello everyone, it is your favorite sustainable and ethical fashion content creator and educator, both here on YouTube as well as on TikTok and a variety of other social media platforms, which can be found via the link in my bio. In today's video, we're taking a departure from our traditional style of lookbooks and DIY videos and style inspiration videos and talking about sustainable and ethical fashion to start a new series on this channel, which will be a series of video essays where I analyze fashion throughout the years and decades with a special focus on teenage fashion. Traditionally, many of these videos and video series do start in the 1950s, but I thought to be different, we would start a little later in the 1960s. This is a decade where teenagers truly did have power for one of the first times, both as a spending power as well as social and political power, as teenagers in the 1960s were more involved in political and social movements than ever before. All of my research comes from a variety of YouTube videos throughout this platform. If you would like a comprehensive list of the sources I used for my information, please contact me using the email in the description down below, and I will be happy to provide it. So let us begin. In the 1960s, the idea of the teenager, which had been first established in the 1950s as a way to sell clothing to a new market, had entered its heyday. In the 1960s, teenagers were more likely to call themselves teenagers, and companies across the economic space were the most likely to sell to teenagers and market to teenagers specifically. In addition to that, the 1960s had multiple different eras within it. And these eras greatly infected teenagers, the fashion of teenagers, as well as the way teenagers were seen by their parents and those that were older than them in society. The 1960s is considered a turning point in teenage fashion and the way teenagers were seen and viewed, as I've mentioned already. The decade really started out with more 1950s inspired clothing, things like what we saw on JFK, Jackie Kennedy, both of whom were very well known across history and greatly impacted the fashion of teenagers and those older than them. But by the time we hit the end of the 60s, we had fully swung the pendulum the other way to the counterculture movement. The early 60s, everything was very structured, very strict. Your very stereotypical posh and prim and proper fashion that you saw in the 50s. The early 60s were very much an extent of the 50s. Many of the outfits and styles we saw in these teenagers were very conservative and often featured sweater sets, knee-length skirts, just sweaters, lots of sweaters. Think 50s prim and proper, late 50s post-war. The 60s are still post-war. While these teenagers were dressing very conservatively and getting their fashion inspo from their friends and magazines, their mothers were getting more of their inspiration from celebrities such as Audrey Hepburn and Jackie Kennedy. As previously mentioned, JFK and Jackie Kennedy are both considered fashion icons of the early 1960s, as that's when JFK's presidency was most well known. As we know, JFK would be assassinated in 1965 in Dallas, Texas. But now, to get into the mid-50s, this is where we start to see the very stereotypical swingin' 60s fashion. The things that you see in Halloween costumes from this time, as well as a lot of media from this time. A great example of a piece of media this time that really shows the fashion is actually Scooby-Doo. You can see this most on the characters of Daphne and Velma. Scooby-Doo began airing in the later 60s, but is very much a testament to the mid-1960s, around 1965 and 1966. We also see bands such as the Beatles and the Who make their debut in America and start to emerge, and with them comes along the British mod style, which started in London and is what most people associate with the 60s, and is one of my personal favorite fashion movements of all time, as you can tell by my Twiggy mod inspired makeup. makeup, where I used blue eyeshadow and drew on fake eyelashes that look like my real ones because they're clumpy. Many of the teenagers of the mid-1960s were trying to emulate what The Who and the Beatles were wearing and what fashionable teenagers and young adults were wearing across the pond in London. For the guys, this meant wearing tighter pants, mod-inspired suits, which were oftentimes tighter than the crisp slacks that they were wearing in America, and that was most popular in America during the 1950s. They also began to grow their hair out longer. Obviously, not as long as we would start to see towards the end of the decade when the counterculture came into play, and we would see in the following decade, which we'll talk about in the next video in the series. In 1965, the term youthquake was coined by Diana Vreeland, who was the editor-in-chief of Vogue at the time. The term youthquake was used to refer to the social changes that the youth of the time were bringing and living through. Some of the places these societal and social changes were seen was in fashion, obviously, music with the emergence of rock and roll, such as bands like the Beatles, The Who, and to an extent the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones would actually begin to get more popular in the 70s, and they have a greater impact on the social culture and the fashion of the 1970s. So we'll talk about them more in the next video in this series, as well as changes that were seen in politics at the time. Think about movements such as the civil rights movement or the feminist movement, both of these beginning to stir in the 1960s. The civil rights movement had its capstone in 1965 when Lyndon B. Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act. But many people don't know the feminist movement. The second wave feminist movement would begin in 1965. And many of these teenagers began to become wrapped up in these social and political movements throughout the 1960s to fight for equal rights and better justice, as well as equal access to voting and opportunities like that. And then the final most important political, social, and historical event that was happening in the 1960s was the Vietnam War. The U.S. had been in the Vietnam War for at least 10 years at this point, having started the Vietnam War in the late 50s. Excuse me. But even though the U.S. had started in the 1950s, the war truly got its most publicized and most worst effects in the 1960s, due to escalating actions that were passed by U.S. President throughout the 1950s, John F. Kennedy, as well as Lyndon B. Johnson, who escalated the war and escalated the draft of young men. Vietnam War protests can be seen across the fashion of the 1960s, but we see it even more when we talk about the counterculture. It is not as relevant to the early 1960s. Another aspect of the term youthquake that was coined by Diana Vreeland for Vogue in 1965 was the fact that teenagers were no longer following the fashion trends of their parents and the older generations, but instead were creating their new ones through embracing elements of personal style and things they saw their friends wearing rather than what they saw their parents wearing and what older company executives were marketing to them. In 1967, a phenomenon was brought on because it was triggered by the arrival of British model Twiggy to New York City. Twiggy triggered a phenomenon in which mod fashion truly was swept up in those that may have not already incorporated mod fashion. those who don't know, Twiggy is one of the biggest mod fashion icons throughout the 1960s. But now, moving on to the in 1967, the fashion of the era, especially for teenagers, would take a massive swing towards hippie and bohemian culture with the rise of the counterculture movement. Many of these hippies and those that were embracing this hippie style and this bohemian style were actually rich white kids. But they were embracing this because they were wearing handmade and DIY pieces. This is my personal favorite era of 60s fashion because it leads into my personal favorite decade of fashion, which you will find out later on in this series. A major historical moment that would impact the late 60s fashion, specifically the counterculture, was the Summer of Love, which would occur in 1967 in the summer in San Francisco, and more specifically within the San Francisco neighborhood of Haight-Ashbury. Most of the fashion that would come out of this would become more loose and relaxed, and we'd see more prevalent fashion trends such as the maxi skirt instead of the mini skirt, the maxi dress, bell sleeves, bell bottoms, and platforms. We would also see a emergence of bolder accessories and more of them. The two biggest styles in the 1960s were the mod style and the hippie style. Mod style is what most people think of when they think of the 60s. That's what you think of stereotypically, as I've mentioned in this video already. Mod style became most prevalent when British bands like The Who and the Beatles came to town. The Beatles made their debut in the US in 1964 by debuting on The Ed Sullivan Show. They booked their first tour in the US in 1965. When we look at videos of the Beatles at this time, they are wearing tighter, more fitting suits that were common of the mod style, which began in London, which is near Liverpool, where the Beatles are from and founded. A great example of this within the Beatles is the suits namely worn by my personal favorite Beatle, Paul McCartney, and Ringo Starr. As you can tell, these suits are more fitted, more tight, versus the suits that were worn in the 1950s that are on my left. 1950s by Americans. These suits are what would become more prevalent and would then continue to impact the style of suits throughout the US and throughout fashion history. The most well-known aspects of mod style are not the suits and those worn by men in the mod style. They were actually the female fashion and the fashion that women traditionally wore in the mod style. Mod style, which began in London, is mostly known for elements such as mini skirts, bright colors, Peter Pan colors, and graphic prints. Each of these has a really unique element of it. It shocked the older generation who grew up with the 1950s, with Christian Dior's new look, which was very structured. Meanwhile, mod fashion was not as structured, not as loose, was more tight, and showed off more. The miniskirt, which was designed by fashion history icon Mary Quant, caused a commotion because it was so short that it exposed parts of legs that had never been seen before in fashion, such as the upper thigh. But now the miniskirt is considered an essential part of so much fashion. Another element of mod fashion that it did was it broke social norms for women, and it gave women more freedom. And it gave them more freedom to show off, more freedom to dress the way they wanted to, and liberated them from strict social norms that we saw in the 1950s. The counterculture movement, on the other hand, was most categorized by the hippies and the bohos, or the bohemians. These were two major fashion movements that, while they have their issues, such as stealing traditional clothing and traditional cultural practices that are close to members of those cultures, such as Native American cultures and Romani cultures, as well as just Black cultures and voodoo cultures. they still had their mark on fashion history, right? Because they brought us elements that we had never seen before, such as the maxi skirt, which is now an essential in every woman's closet, as well as bell-bottom jeans, which are now considered a staple of retro fashion and retro style. And even more, it brought us musicians such as Creedence Clearwater Revival, Fleetwood Mac, pre-Stevie, as well as the very well-known hippie musicians of Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. The counterculture movement was heavily associated with music styles that now get classified under the broad umbrella of classic rock. We will talk more about the hippie and counterculture movement when we talk about the 70s in the next video in this series, and we will touch more on musicians for the counterculture movement then. 9 fashion trends that emerged during the 1960s include mini skirts, which were designed by Mary Quant, as previously mentioned, go-go boots, which were previously worn by go-go dancers in the Hey Go-Go Club in LA, which is on the Sunset Strip and no longer exists anymore. Pillbox hats, which were at their height and most common in the early 1960s, as they were seen worn by fashion icon Jackie Kennedy. Tie-dye was another element that began to emerge in the 1960s and continues to be relevant in fashion and summer camps across the world to this very day. Shift dresses, which once again is another element that remains a staple throughout fashion, began to emerge in the 1960s. The Nehru jackets, which were popularized by the Indian Prime Minister at the time, became very popular for men after they were seen being sported by known India fanatic George Harrison and other male celebrities of the time, such as James Brown. The maxi dress, as previously mentioned, began to emerge in the 1960s along with the counterculture movement and continued to last into the 1970s and even beyond. And the final item of fashion trends that began to emerge and is most characteristic of this decade is the mod sunglasses, which were round and fat. These sunglasses would continue to impact the way sunglasses are made, the style of sunglasses throughout the decades, even till today. Some style icons of the 1960s, according to Mary Claire, include Princess Grace Kelly, even though she had officially retired from her professional life as an actress and was married to the Prince of Monaco and was then the Princess of Monaco. She by the early 1960s, she had continued to remain a style icon for people in Monaco, the US, and globally in the 1960s. She is most characteristic of the fashion and styles of the early 1960s. A fashion icon of the late 1960s is Diane Carroll. We will talk more about her in next week's video on the 1970s. Another style icon of the 1960s is Natalie Wood, who is a style icon of the late 1950s and the early 1960s. We also have Catherine Deneuve, who is most characteristic of the fashion of the late 60s and early 1970s. And our next two fashion icons are names you've probably heard associated with the 1960s. These are Tippi Hedren, who is most characteristic of the mod style of the mid-1960s, and Raquel Welch, who is most characteristic of the fashion and styles of the late 1960s. Another aspect of culture that affects fashion is musicians, and some of the musicians that were most relevant and known in the 1960s include the Beatles, as mentioned, who were pretty much prominent throughout the entire 1960s. Their most prominent years were from 1963 to 1970, when the band would break up. Another characteristic musician of the 1960s is James Brown, who, just like the Beatles, was pretty much around from the middle of the 60s to even later on in the 70s. His most characteristic era would have been from 1963 to 1970, just like the Beatles. The Beach Boys also made an emergence in the American music scene, namely in their home state of California, where they are most associated with songs such as the Good Vibrations. They, like the Beatles, were around for almost the entire decade. They were actually around for a lot longer than the Beatles and some of the other musicians on this list. And they would continue to make music even after the 1960s, and they will continue to show up throughout this series as a musical impact on fashion, style, and culture throughout the years. Their most active years in the 1960s, though, were from 1961 to 1966. Another aspect was the girl group, the Supremes. Their most well-known song is You Can't Hurry Love, which is in almost every 60s movie or documentary, and pretty much characterizes the vibe of the music scene of the 1960s that teenagers in the 1960s were listening to. They were not around as long as some of the artists I've previously mentioned, such as the Beatles and James Brown. They were around for a lot shorter of a time period. They were around from 1964 to 1969. They did not continue to make music and receive the same relevance into the 1970s. The next artist is the Rolling Stones. As I've mentioned, the Rolling Stones, while they were making music as well as being important and impactful to the culture and fashion of the youth in the 1960s, they were a lot more relevant to the counterculture movement in the 1970s. Their most active years were from 1964 to 1970. That would be from the middle of the 1960s to the beginning of the 1970s. We'll talk more about their impact on music in the 1970s. The next artist we have is Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, well, he continues to make music throughout the 1970s, even into the 80s and today, was at the peak of his fame and most relevant in the 1960s, around the time that he released his first album and made his debut. His first album, The Freewheeling Bob Dylan, came out in 1965, which makes his most active years from 1963 to 1966. If you want more information about Bob Dylan in the 1960s, the best place to start would be the recently released biopic starring Timothée Chalamet.
One more thing! Chalamet!
A complete unknown. Another artist, a very well-known and important female artist in the 1960s, would be Aretha Franklin. She is most characteristic of the soul movement of the late 1960s and early 1970s. She was one of the first women in soul and is one of the only women to have lied in state at a state capital. Her most active years in the 1960s are from 1966 to 1970. Her music was used as a movement for change throughout the counterculture movement as well, so she will get briefly touched on in next week's video on the 1970s. The next artist we have is Elvis Presley. Even though Elvis Presley passed away in 1970 and was most characteristic of the early rock and roll movements of the mid to late 1950s, he would continue to write and produce music even into the 1960s. And be an impactful figure on music and culture throughout the 1960s. He is though, unlike some of the previously mentioned artists, he is most impactful and characteristic of the earlier part of the decade from 1959 to 1963, when the 60s were more like the decade that had preceded them in the 1950s. He would only fade from relevance a little bit, though, even though he was not very active or well known throughout music. He would continue to make and produce music until his passing in 1970. The next artist we have that is characteristic of the early 1960s is social and political music icon Sam Cooke, most known for his style of music that resembles early rock and roll icons such as the previously mentioned Elvis Presley, as well as Little Richard. He is not someone who continued to make music after the 1960s and 70s and released the same amount of fame as he did in the mid to late 1950s as well as the early 1960s. Sam Cooke would be most active from 1959 to 1964. And the final artist we'll talk about, which will also lead us into next week's video on the 1970s, will be Jimi Hendrix, most known for being a member of his band, the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Jimi Hendrix, as previously mentioned, is one of the most well-known icons of the 1960s and 70s counterculture movement, even though he would pass away in 1970 as well in January. He made most of his music in a 4-year stretch in the late 1960s prior to his passing, and his music would become characteristic of what we now think of as the hippies and the counterculture movement in the late 1960s into the early 1970s. His impact on music is more relevant in the late 1960s and very early 1970s, from around the year 1969 to 1973. So he will get more of a mention in next week's video in the 1970s. But his most active years in the 1960s, as mentioned, were 1966 to 1970, as he is considered to be the artist most known for the soundtrack of the Summer of Love historical event that occurred in San Francisco, because of the home that he stayed at being located in that Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. Another artist that I don't have on my notes that was very impactful to both the 1960s and 70s. Hello, everyone. I apologize for the cutoff. My phone is running out of storage, but next week we will make the second video in this series and we will talk about the 1970s. That is all you need to know about the fashion of the 1960s and how teenagers wore it, which means it's time for the outro. As most of you know, I hate doing outros, but no video is complete without an outro. So if you liked this video and you want to see more content like this about 1960s fashion and teenage fashion, hit the like button. That tells me and the YouTube algorithm that you like my face and you want to see more content by me and more content like this video made by other creators. If you didn't like it, go ahead and hit the dislike. I can't see the number. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see fashion content, just in all of the things that make fashion the greatest thing to me. Yeah, I mostly talk about sustainable and ethical fashion. Feel free to leave a comment if you would like. Check out all of my social medias, which are linked in the description. If you would like a full list of sources on how this video was made, please email me using the email in the description. All of my social medias are linked in the link tree down below, including my photography and Etsy side businesses and side projects. Thank you all, I love you all, and I will see you next week.